Hello, everybody, and welcome to this courageous conversation on race. I'm Peggy Oliveira, and I am a former trauma therapist, and I'm a social worker. And I am sitting today with Terry, and we've already had one conversation, but we are having this conversation for a few different reasons, and we'll share more about that in a few moments. But I want to take this time and welcome Terry and have him introduce himself. So Terry, please.
Hi, Peggy. Thank you for having me. My name is Terry Parham. I'm from Boston. You'll hear my Boston accent throughout the discussion today, but I want to thank you for your efforts in what you're trying to do. It's very unusual. We're in some unusual times in our country, and the subject of race is so important for me personally, for my family, and we'll talk more about that. But again, thank you for having me. I look forward to our discussion.
My pleasure. I really am looking forward to this, and this may expand beyond just our conversation today, which I would also really look forward to. So I want to share with you a little bit about how this conversation came to be. Back in the beginning of June, I sent out an email to my community, and it was shortly after George Floyd's death. And I decided to send out an email to my community because I know that I have a lot of people of color who follow me, but the majority of people are certainly white. And I think there are different reasons for that, but I wanted to be really, really clear with my community that they mattered to me, that the people of color, in particular at that time, that the Black people in my community mattered deeply to me, because I don't think that I had ever specifically said that. And it's unfortunate that we live in a time which we have continued to live in, it's never changed, where that doesn't feel inclusive automatically. So I sent out a newsletter, an email to my community, just letting them know that they do matter to me and that I would strive to do better, to learn, to practice. And Terry sent me an email back, and it was a lovely email sharing some different thoughts. And we decided, after a few back and forth, we decided to hop on a call together and just share our thoughts about some different things. And it ended up being a 3-hour-long conversation because it was just so full of experience and hopes and concerns, ideas, that it just went on for quite some time. And we decided that it might be a really nice idea to have two people, a Black man and a white woman, with obviously diverse experiences. Terry is also a former retired DEA agent, which I think is a really interesting perspective to have. And I, as a social worker and trauma therapist, to bring our personal and professional experience together to talk about some of the issues that are certainly not new. But I think that we are in a time that people are maybe a little bit more open to hearing about, to listening, to really opening their minds and their hearts to seeing and experiencing something different. So thank you again, Terry, for being here. Thank all of you for watching. And please feel free to leave your thoughts and your comments in the comments below, and I will make sure to come back and address any questions, comments that I can. And I'm looking forward to sharing this space with you. So again, welcome, Terry. Thank you for being here.
And again, I applaud you for this. As you were talking, what comes to mind for me, also asking myself, why are we here? Why is today and what's going on in this country so important? It brings back memories that, as you and I discussed before, memories of childhood. I grew up in a mostly white environment in Brockton, Massachusetts. I was born and raised initially in Dorchester, which is just outside of Boston. Then we moved to this exclusively white neighborhood. We were the only Black family there. And so as I understand it now, I recognize that even as a child, I had to conform. I had to adapt to a white world, a white environment. Didn't understand it necessarily as a child, but I think it was more of a survival mechanism of just to get along and be liked and to grow and make friends. And so went to elementary school, junior high school, I call it middle school now, high school, college, all in the Boston area, and went through some interesting experiences that you and I shared. It's, what we're talking about brings back the memories of being touched, being kind of, people rubbing my skin, looking at the bottoms of my feet and asking why there's a difference of color between the top of my hand and the bottom of my palm, etc. Touching my hair, wondering if I comb my hair. I don't have any hair now to comb, but no, there were a lot of things that as a young Black child that I had to now understand, what I went through and to adapt and like I said, conform to the way people wanted me to be. I got through it. I survived. I told you before, I dated a girl who was of Italian descent, went through some interesting, very interesting now particularly, experiences of being asked over for dinner. I was that traditional guess who's coming to dinner moment where the father of my then girlfriend, I dated for 6 years, she was my high school sweetheart, and the father, first thing he says to me is, what about the kids? And I'm 18 years old, and I'm like saying, well, I just want to date your daughter. You're kind of talking about things I didn't really understand. And so I didn't necessarily recognize that as racism per se. I clearly see it as that of the culture we lived in then, and which hasn't changed much from that period. That was 30, 40 years ago. But, through high school, through college, had similar experiences that followed me all the way into my professional life. You had mentioned I'm retired from the Drug Enforcement Administration, from DEA. I did 30 years as a special agent. And one thing I can tell you, for those that aren't familiar with how police are trained and law enforcement folks are trained, they trained me to work undercover, to work surveillances, to understand investigations, to testify in court. All of the attributes of what an agent or what a police officer is supposed to do. What they didn't teach me and didn't prepare me for was the culture of law enforcement. And when I say that, there's a lot of isms that kind of are connected with that. You had, your alcoholism, I'm just talking reality of the age that I grew up in with DEA, sexism, and then unfortunately in my case, the racism. I was one of the first Black agents in the New England division at the time. And the majority of the folks there treated me well. So I don't want to paint a negative picture, but there were several folks that around me would use the N-word, or around me treated me, in a way that was different from how they treated other other white agents, let's say. Even down to, I would get stopped routinely by the state police driving home. And when I showed them my badge and credentials, I'll never forget one time the trooper didn't believe I was a DEA agent. And he basically told me, no, you're not a DEA agent because I know every DEA agent in the office and you're not one of them. And so, experiences like that, the public has heard a lot about Black children, teenagers, adults being stopped by the police. We get stopped by the police. I get stopped at gunpoint because my registration sticker on the back of my car was out of date. And then when I showed my badge and credentials to explain I'm a police officer, why are you doing this? He says, well, the real reason why we stopped it because one of our officers was shot by a Black person the night before, and you just happened to be in the neighborhood, so we needed to find out who you were. So I could go on and on with stories like that. It's unfortunate that society has been the way I had to experience it. Now I can tell you that I survived. That I got through 30 years as a special agent and enjoyed my career, made a lot of friends, had a lot of mentors, but I can tell you that racism was front and center throughout my life. I ultimately, while I was an agent, I became the president of the National Association of Black Narcotics Agents back in the late 90s. And I'll never forget speaking with the top echelon of the agency back then. The questions were posed to me, well, what do Black agents want? And quick answer was, we want equality, we want fairness, we want to be treated as the other agents are being treated. And that was always looked at with the reaction was either a snicker of some kind, believe it or not, at that level, and we were left with disbelief of realizing we're in a culture which I look at it this way. DEA is a microcosm of society. And so the way society operated is how police and agencies like DEA, law enforcement agencies like DEA would operate. It's obvious today that it's something that's being brought to everyone's attention and brought up for discussion. It's critical that we have this discussion about race. It's critical for what you're doing and the platform that you have. I'm hoping more people that look like you will have this conversation, feel comfortable. I can tell you, I have this conversation a lot, particularly over the last couple of months with peers and friends. Most of the reaction I get is they're a little uncomfortable or very uncomfortable to have this conversation, to talk about race. They don't know what to say. They think I'm going to accuse them of being a racist, which, if that's the case, if that's who you are, that's who you are, and then we get into semantics of defining what racism is, because everyone has kind of a different perspective as to what that really means. And then when I talk about white privilege, which you and I chatted about before, and a lot of my friends don't understand what that means, and I try to simplify it by saying that, sure, we each may have had struggles and obstacles and challenges to get to where we are today. I said, but you didn't have to struggle and deal with obstacles because of your race. Mm-hmm. And they shake their head just like you just did. Yeah, well, I get it, but it's still, what do we do with that? How do we move forward with that today? And that's kind of a big question. I mean, I still struggle with trying to ask myself the questions: what does an equal society or equality in our society for everyone look like? Okay. And then knowing the history of this country, which is kind of sad now that, and hopefully everyone is absorbing all this history that we're learning about. I mean, I'm learning more about the Confederacy and statues that I never thought twice about before, and realizing this history was founded on white superiority. And it really was. I mean, you talk about the British and the Europeans and the French and whoever else came out over here back in the day. Christopher Columbus, that's kind of a controversial topic these days as well. And the idea that they could come here and just slaughter the Native Americans and then bring over Africans to build their economy and then basically have a civil war on what to do with these African Americans, these Black people, and then build monuments to the folks that lost the war. I could go on and on. I don't mean to rant, but there's just so much that I think is vital for everyone to talk about, to listen, because as much as you're listening to me and your audience is listening to some of the things that I experienced, I'm interested in hearing what the white person, the white perspective is on this, because what you're doing is not normal. Which really, what we're talking about and how we're talking about this is almost like a once in a lifetime, hopefully more in a lifetime moment. But most people would not put themselves in this position to even have to verbalize what we're talking about.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason my business is Courageous Journeys, and I named it that because talking about anything that feels vulnerable, dealing with our personal histories that are vulnerable, takes a lot of courage. And these kinds of conversations, because there is so much pain, because there is so much history, because there is so much wounding and so much uncertainty about what it means going forward, that this is for anybody who's having these conversations, whether it's with a friend, a partner, or in public, whatever that looks like, it is an incredibly courageous conversation to have if you're being open and honest. And I think that there were so many things that you said that I think are so important. And being able, no matter what our color, I think being able to be really connected within ourselves of what do we think, what do we fear, what do we hope for, that can be difficult for people across the board. And these kinds of conversations cause us to take a moment and check within and see. And it's the same kind of thing. And we talked about this a little bit in our other conversation. Like there are some parallels. Obviously, there's a lot of differences, but there are some parallels in what is happening now and the kind of conversations that need to happen, the kind of changes, systemic changes that need to happen. There's some parallels there with the realm of sexual assault and abuse. So having these kinds of conversations, open, vulnerable, honest, challenging, is something that I actually really enjoy doing. And for people that have followed me for any period of time, I talk about all kinds of things that are difficult. I just typically tend to talk about them in the realm of sexual abuse and assault and changing society's views and letting go of shame and all of that. And shame is one of the reasons, particularly I think for white people, that it can be an incredibly challenging conversation to have, because we're often not conscious of it. But I think that there is a lot of shame that is attached to the reality of us as an individual being and our ancestry and what they have created, as going back to what you were just talking about in terms of certainly African Americans owning people, and then also the slaughtering of natives to this land. And so it is interesting. And for me, much of this is about my professional experience. And so my experience as a trauma therapist, my experience as a social worker, and social justice issues, no matter what that is. But the reality is, just like part of the reason I talk about sexual assault is I'm a survivor. But when it comes to race, while it's not my area of expertise at all, I became very aware of racism Again, I don't know that I would have called it that specifically, but I became very aware of racism very early in my life because I was raised in a family that was quite racist. I don't know that they would have called themselves that, which is, I think, also interesting and part of the disconnect I think that we have so often. Because my family wasn't necessarily, they certainly weren't wearing robes. They were not violent. My brother was a little bit of a different issue later on in life. But for the most part, my family, they were not often what we tend to think of as racists. But the ideas were there. The ideas of what Black people were. And what that is, I'm not exactly entirely sure. It was just, they were different, right? They were somehow not as good. And I remember as a young kid being aware of that and thinking, it didn't seem to make a lot of sense. You mentioned Christopher Columbus, and I remember being a young child, probably like no more than third grade, and it was Columbus Day. And I remember thinking, what must Native Americans, and I don't remember at that time what we referred to them as specifically, but like I just remember thinking, well, they probably don't like this holiday. It was like it was an awareness, but I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. So for me, recognizing, and I recognized this a long time ago, I think mostly through my education is where I became really aware. And then again, in these last couple of months, being able to really recognize how little I actually know about history, because I hated history, all history, when I was in school. And so therefore, I didn't learn anything really about the Confederacy. I didn't know very much about the Civil War. I didn't know much about any of the statues, that we're talking about. I really didn't know much of that. And so for me, these last couple of months have been a lot of trying to understand specific historical events. Black Wall Street, that was something I had not heard of.
Same here. Same.
Until very recently.
I had never heard of Black Wall Street, except for about a year ago. There might have been some TV program that gave some perspective to it.
I think that might have been when I heard it too.
And I turned around and asked my friends, did you hear about this? Did you know about this? And some of them said no. Someone said, yeah, I remember reading something anecdotally over the, recent times, let's say, but that's part of history. Going back to a thought that came to mind when you were speaking, we're kind of talking a lot, I think, about human behavior, and racism to me kind of fits in that of a study of us as human beings in many respects, and I mean. You mentioned your childhood a little bit, and you might remember this story from when we last spoke, but I'll never forget. And these are things that are like imprinted on inside of me and part of my being. I'll never forget. I'm 8 years old, and it's a Saturday morning, 10 o'clock or so in the morning. I get a knock on the door. My mother had gone to the store. I was there by myself in the house, and it was the father of a girl that lived down the street. Remember, I grew up as I said, in an all-white neighborhood, and the girl that I knew was this classmate. We were in like the second or third grade, and he asked if my mother was home, and I said no. He said, well, can I come in? And I'm 8 years old, so he comes in and he looks at me and he says, I'm here to tell you to stay away from my daughter. And I'm trying to think now, his daughter was someone we used to walk to school together, and we were friends. She was in my classes in the second and third grade. And he started getting angry, and he's like saying, you stay away from my daughter. And he then was telling me that his brother was killed by a Black guy, and he hates Black people because of that. And I'm looking, I'll never forget, I'm looking up to him, trying to process as an 8-year-old what this man is there for, and what his message was. And I don't know what the trauma effect would have been, how you gauge that. I probably was under some form of trauma, not understanding why this adult who I knew he was the father of this girl, but yeah, I mean, that's the human behavioral part of this that I totally don't understand from a racist perspective, or those that have racist behaviors or exhibit that. I mean, that's an extreme. Another one you might remember, uh, going back to my girlfriend, we were at a friend of mine from high school. He was on the football team. I was a teammate of his, and he had a pool party at his house, and all of us are sitting there. I'm the only black person in the group, and having pizza, drinking beer. We're in the pool. The parents weren't home, and all of a sudden, while we're sitting in the living room, a car rolls into the driveway, and it happens to be the host kid's father, and he panics, and he's running around like a chicken with his head cut off. And his father comes in, and as soon as his father looks into the living room, he trains his eyes on me. He's looking at me sitting there. I'm the only black person in there. And my friend then yells out, "Don't worry, Dad, he's Portuguese." And there was silence in the room. He then called his son into the back room or whatever, and his name was Paul. Paul comes out and he says, "The party's over. Everyone has to leave." And so we got up, and I'm trying to process the behavior. I'm trying to process my friend who's the football team reacting the way he did, and where he came up with this Portuguese thing, which to this day, and you and I kind of talked about that before, but it's amazing, the behavior part. And as a black person, I have trouble, and still do today, of understanding the white mentality of the racist kind of behaviors that kind of are a product of what we're dealing with. I don't know what your thoughts would be on that.
I do have some thoughts. Again, I'm not an expert in this, but I think that much of it really is passed down. So like I said, I grew, my family was racist, but not really like overt. There were some things like in terms of languaging, my family did use the N-word. So I am a little bit older. I think less families are saying that now. But my family did, but it wasn't from a place of like anger. Like it wasn't like name calling specifically. It was like the term, like black person. Instead, they use the N-word, which isn't okay at all. But that's kind of, and it was passed down from generation to generation to generation.
And I'm glad you're using the term N-word, because I told you before, I grew up, my parents taught us that's the word that we don't say as children. It was something that I grew up hating to hear, even though, as you know, even within the black community, people use the actual word. It's in pop culture and rap music, etc. But when I speak about it as an adult, even today, I use the term N-word. I don't like to say disparaging words about any particular ethnicity or I mean, that's why I'm fascinated too, and I don't mean to change the subject, but I'm fascinated too what's happening with the Washington. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and the famous team, the football team, is going through a name change issue over the racist name of their team that they've had for decades or longer. And so anyway, it's just fascinating, how words play into behaviors and how people kind of deal with that, process that.
Absolutely. And language matters. The words that we use, the adjectives that we use to describe people, no matter who that person is, it influences how we feel. So even though I had a sense that this didn't make sense, like this was silly, this was stupid, it doesn't make any sense to me, some of those things were still kind of ingrained, right? And I think that has been the case. And part of why it continues to be the case is that people don't talk about it. People don't talk about it. Just like with sexual assault and abuse, people don't talk about it in open ways. And so all the myths, all the stereotypes, all the shame continues to be passed down collectively because nobody's actually talking about it. And I think the same thing is true. Like even people, even like millennials right now and younger, it's changing because there is more conversation happening. But if people in families, in our communities are not talking about the reality of what's happening, no matter what it is, then the ideas that are passed down very subtly in many ways continue to be perpetuated because nobody's doing anything to vocalize it in a way where it can be discussed, therefore certainly not able to change anything about it, which is part of the reason that I really, when you sent that email back to me, I was really interested in being able to have this conversation because it's going to take more than you and I having this conversation and anybody who's watching this. It's going to take everybody being willing to have conversations that are uncomfortable, where we can own our reality of what we think, how we feel, what we've experienced, and any guilt and or shame that is associated with that. It doesn't mean that we've had to have done something wrong specifically, but shame is also passed down. When people don't want to talk about something, it's often because shame is attached to it.
Yeah. Now, there's one thing that we spoke about before that I'm fascinated about, don't fully understand. We talked about the fear factor, and that is, I think I was sharing with you, again, I'm recently, or way back, in this is in the mid-90s, but I had just come from overseas, and I was, my wife called me to ask me to pick up some cereal and some milk and eggs and things for the kids, and I stop at a supermarket. This is in the Florida area, and I'm dressed in a three-piece suit, and I might have had I think I recall wearing a raincoat or something, trench coat, but dressed professionally. And I'm looking for the cereal aisle, and I'm walking down the cereal aisle, and there's a white female with a child in a carriage. She looks up at me. I mean, our eyes kind of met, but she looks at me, and she immediately runs over to her child and kind of guards him. And while I wasn't really paying attention until I realized what she was doing, and I'm thinking to myself, she's fearful of something. What is that about? And I personally had trouble, trying to understand what is it about white people when they look at black people that they, and I know I'm generalizing, but still it's just, kind of a similar circumstance. And didn't know if you've ever seen something like that or know pretty much what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and I think that we talked about this a little bit too, but part of that fear comes from not talking about it, right? Because even if people of color are talked about from a respectful place in a white person's family, if you don't know Black people, if it's not talked about the reality of Black people in this country, if you're completely ignorant, and I don't mean that from a judgmental place, but just ignorant of the reality, we, as humans, we fear that which we don't know. That's a natural thing for all humans. We fear things that we don't know or understand. And so if you don't have conversations, if you don't know Black people, if you don't have people in your life, then you don't get to understand that they're just like us, that there's nothing to be afraid of. But when you add on top of it, that as part of a way to keep Black people separate, down ultimately, that society had to make Black people different. They had to be different. And the reality is, white people at that time, like so back in slavery and when slavery was supposed to be completely abolished, people were afraid of their life, not for their life specifically, but of their lifestyle, of everything that they had gained. Well, what's going to happen if these people that we owned, because remember there's shame attached to that as well, what's going to happen? I own them, we own them as collective, we white people own them. If we no longer own them, then what do they have the ability? What are they going to want to do? And so that fear, I think, is without anybody having to say anything, that fear, or without very many people, I guess, having to say anything, that fear becomes kind of instilled. Obviously, it's not based on reality. It's not based on anything reasonable even, but it is just something we don't know, because white people had only experienced Black people, for the most part, white people had only experienced Black people as something to be owned. Very different. You are over here, you do the work, you are not part of our lives, and we are here. If we start kind of integrating, so to speak, if you become more like us, then where does that leave me? And I think there's some bigger pieces to this, or more pieces, I guess I should say, to this. But just from a psychological perspective, that has a lot to do with it. Again, it's not based on anything that is real or reasonable.
Well, but add another realistic component to this. They're projecting, as you know, by 2050 or at least by 2060, white people will become the minority
Yeah.
in the country. So I know, just in general, talking with my friends, there is a concern, even though it's not vocalized as such, but that's going to mean something. That's going to, and I'm curious, just from a historical perspective. I probably won't be around them, but still, I'm curious as to how our society will sustain being a society, given the reversal, and particularly if this kind of, the sense of racism kind of being brought to the forefront for the good and sometimes for the bad. If the bad part of this, the racists, the anarchists, whatever, if they want to bring this forward, into some larger, issue, that part of it, that historical part of or what's going to happen 30, 40, 50 years from now, it's going to play a big role in how people react and how they look at that and what they accept. I mean, what are white people going to accept?
Well, I think it's, in a sense, I think it's a very similar thing to when they were freed, when the slaves were freed. It's obviously a different situation, but in a way it's kind of similar, because white people didn't have to worry, right? Because they had no rights, because they didn't have any freedom. And so everything was okay. Once they started to have some freedom and wanted rights as equal participants in our society, it was threatened. And so that fear is really the same type of fear at a visceral level of what you were just saying about becoming a minority, because being a majority always gives you more power to an extent. And depending on what that power is, it could be a huge extent. So I think that is part of what we're seeing, and part of the reason that over these last 4 to 5 years or so, that a lot of people have really been able to openly embrace, because it's become, I don't know that for some people it has become more acceptable, I suppose, because that angst, that uncertainty, that fear is present, because that is something that's being talked about quite a bit, that white people will no longer be the majority in this country. And it's the same process, in a sense, playing out.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to go back and ask you a question. When you were kind of introducing yourself a little bit, you talked about kind of growing up in a white neighborhood and and some different experiences, but you said that you didn't really identify it as racism, and of course you wouldn't really, being a young child, and you just know that this is what you're experiencing, and sometimes it doesn't feel good or whatever. Do you have a sense of when you were able to recognize in the moment, so not necessarily years later looking back on it, but at what point in your life did you have an experience of racism that you recognized it as such at the time? Do you have a sense of that?
Probably the high school experience with my girlfriend then, because intertwined in some of the experiences was, again, elementary school. This is back before we took buses to school. So if you went for lunch, you had the opportunity of either walking home or going to someone else's house for lunch. And I got invited to a friend of mine from third, fourth grade or whatever for lunch. And we're sitting in her kitchen. Her mother's serving us tuna fish sandwiches or something. And her father comes home, and he basically sees me. Again, I'm what, 8, 9, 10 years old, I guess. And he called me the N-word. He says, "What is that N-word doing in here?" And the mother had to kind of calm him down. And now I knew what that was. I mean, even at that age, I was probably more still in my conforming mindset, adapting mindset of not doing anything that's going to provoke anything. Possibly, and I'm thinking back now, someone that lived in the Black community, and if that same dynamic happened, might have had a totally different reaction, to being called that. I chose to just accept it, I guess, for lack of a better term, or not say anything, but I recall it, I internalized it. I probably told my mother when I got home or something, that afternoon or whatever, but it wasn't something that my mother would have, called that parent up and say, "Hey, you're a racist," whatever. My mother wasn't like that, and she basically taught us to just, be good people, good children. We went to church and everything, all white church at that, and get along, conform, just fit in. You'll survive if you do that. Mm-hmm. So it probably wasn't until I was older, in my late teens, let's say, because remember too, that would have been after the 60s riots and then into the 70s and the talk of civil rights. And so what we were seeing on then TV and, the networks back then, was consciousness of and understanding racism is an issue. And, Black power was kind of like what was being, mentioned back in the day. And I probably recognized that I was being treated differently as I got older, particularly. I think as a child, most families, accepted me being around. There are stories and recollections rather of not being allowed to go into someone's pool because they, the word was they think that I might be dirtying it up or whatever by being in the pool. But again, those were childhood memories and moments that, I didn't have the capacity to really react to that other than to be in this, hey, this is how I have to get along. This is how I have to survive. I'll do well. I'll be looked at and supported by the community to just keep my focus, moving forward. And I did that. But the obstacles really came into play as I got older.
Yeah. And I think that is such an interesting piece that you can experience something negative, you can experience something harmful, even potentially traumatic, and not recognize it as such. And again, another parallel to sexual abuse as a child, that but still something that has such an impact, like the man coming to your home and saying, "Stay away from my daughter." Like you said, I'm trying to process it. You don't really understand what's happening, but on a very deep level, you're being told that you're not okay. You're being told that you are not good enough. Um, Whether you recognize that because of your color or not, you're still being told you're not good enough. You have to stay away from my daughter. Here's this man. For any child, no matter what your color, for a grown man to come to your house when you're 8 years old, ask if your mom was home, which I think is interesting. And she's not, so you're there by yourself or with no parent around. Come into your house and tell you, stay away from my daughter. My brother, I think you said, or somebody was killed by a Black person. So he's laying that responsibility on you. And of course, at 8 years old, you don't have the ability developmentally to process all of that and understand what it is he's actually saying, but you internalize it nonetheless.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is what is so, so powerful. And I think is for all of us to really understand, no matter whether we're talking about race or anything else, that our experiences as children can have a lasting, deep impact on our sense of self without having any idea that it has, or the way that it has affected our sense of self. And in this conversation, in terms of the legacy of race and racism, no matter what your color, I think that it's really, we need to be able to understand that as Black people, as white people, as brown people, whatever, we need to be able to understand that we have been impacted, whether it has landed in a way that we're very conscious that it's impacted us or not. And in fact, I would say that very often the times that are not conscious, so the times where you don't really understand that it is impacting you, the times where it maybe seems a little bit more subtle, that can actually have more of a lasting impact, a deeper impact, because it doesn't filter through our understanding. It just immediately hits our core belief system and who we believe we are and what we believe about other people.
Right. Right.
So that languaging in my family or in the where I grew up, in the community that I grew up in, I didn't talk much about that today, but much of my childhood, I grew up more surrounded by Black people than I did white people. But that languaging for all of us has an impact. For your mother, if, like you said, you don't, your mother probably wouldn't have done anything. And the reality is your mother knew that she was worried about her children, particularly even at that time, her Black male child, and particularly living in a white community. And I don't know if she was aware that that man came over to your house or not, but she, even if not consciously on her mind, which I imagine it probably was, even if she never shared it specifically, but for your mother to be raising a Black boy, Black children, but especially a Black boy in a white neighborhood, she was aware of the ever-present danger.
Retaliation of some kind.
And not even just retaliation, but of hatred.
Right.
Of just the hatred that existed and the fear. Because hatred often, almost always, stems from fear.
Mm-hmm.
It can stem from love, but that's a different kind of thing. Typically, when we're talking about race, it's almost always about fear. And again, that fear isn't even necessarily a conscious fear. People aren't sitting around thinking, oh, I'm afraid this Black person's going to take my job. I'm afraid this Black person's going to hurt me. I'm afraid this Black person, whatever. People aren't necessarily sitting around thinking that, but it's just the idea. And that has far deeper and far-reaching impact than the things that we are consciously.
And I'll add to it. I've had conversations with both my parents are still alive, and I asked them about the time frame of when we moved to this all-white community, why we moved there, and which was kind of interesting as well. And they're sharing with me that it required a community board of some kind to vote and allow a Black family to move in. And it was, I wasn't aware of that until, recent discussions. But also too, getting back to the behaviors, what are racist behaviors? I find it interesting. I was sharing with a white friend of mine, you may have heard this story before too, probably in my late teens, early 20s, I was working at a department store as a store detective, and I was walking one of the clerks close to her home. She was white, and we're in the Boston area. So in racism, as you probably know historically, has always been an issue in Boston itself. I was walking her, like I said, a couple of blocks away from the store. It was about 5:30 in the afternoon. We stopped at, I'm standing there just talking to her, just chatting about things in general. And a white van pulls up beside us at the light that we were kind of standing near, the street light, and a traffic light rather. And the sliding door opens up, and there was about 8 or 9 white kids in the van, and they each had broomsticks with nails on the end of them. And they were calling me the N-word, and they're poking their stick at me, and I'm jumping away as they were poking at me, and they're saying, "You stay away from white women, you stay away from white women." And then when the light turned green, they pulled off. And I'm bringing that up because I shared that story with a white friend of mine who comes from that generation. He's a little bit older than I am. I'm 63, by the way, and the person I was talking to was probably in his late 60s, early 70s. And his reaction was, well, they were just kids, kind of, and it really showed me that someone else can look at a story like that or hear a story like that and not have the same reaction or same, description of what that really represented. And then it made me realize too, everything I've shared with you thus far in the previous conversations and what we're talking about today, I have not shared with other people in general. And I had to ask myself why. And I think there's a fear of being judged, of someone listening to the stories of, with my girlfriend or my friend from the football team and judging whether that really is even anything to be concerned about. And, or to even consider racist. There are people that wouldn't think of that as being racist behavior. And so it's just kind of a consciousness of mine as we're dealing with and talking about race more and more.
Thank you for sharing that part. And you did not share that story with me. This is the first time that I've heard that particular story. And I appreciate you sharing. You didn't necessarily say it was a concern, but some of the hesitancy in sharing of being judged or ultimately really having that experience, which is horrifying, to have that experience minimized by saying, well, they were just, kids, or it was a time or whatever, because that really is what it is. It's minimizing the experience. It's denying the reality of the fear and the hate, the fear that you experience personally, and the hate from this group of people that have power, again, whether you're consciously thinking that or not, showing up next to you, a bunch of white kids with the potential to seriously harm you, because you're talking to a woman that you happen to work with. That is a traumatic experience. The fact that it happens on a regular basis doesn't change that. Sexual assault happens every 2.5 minutes in this country. It doesn't change the trauma of it. But that that reality, that lack of, or the inability to trust that I'm saying I'm talking kind of generally, but in this particular circumstance, the inability to trust that your experiences, your painful experiences, would be minimized by someone, no matter who that person is the reality as to why so many people do not speak up. And whether we're talking about race issues or sexual assault or sexism or whatever it is, which again is part of the reason that these conversations are so important. And so I'd like to, before we end, I do kind of want to come back to, I'd like you to share with me, with really our audience, because you and I have kind of talked about this, but we talked about having this conversation, and we each have kind of our own desire, like, oh yeah, I think this would be a good conversation to have. I'd love for you to share with everybody just kind of what your hope or your desire is in having this conversation, in the two of us having the conversation, in having it recorded and shared in a more public way. What do you hope to gain? What do you hope is laid?
There's probably several factors in how I'm going to describe this. One of the more important ones from a personal perspective is I have 3 kids, and they're young adults. They're watching all of this happening in our society. They're trying to process it. They're angry, like I am in many respects. They don't necessarily care about the history behind it all like we do, because it's just a generational thing, observation I've made. And I'm hoping that whatever we can do today, whatever we can do tomorrow, will at least start forming that foundation of talking, because I've shared this with you before. I don't know what a totally equal society looks like. I don't know what we all want that to represent, and I'm hoping we can somehow get there. As a Black person, I want to be treated like how you're treated. I want to have the privileges that you have. I want to be, considered for things without the racist kind of factor that has been, endemic in my life. And so, where do we go from here? Well, we talk, we open up dialogue, we share our, share our thoughts, we share our experiences, and we listen, as I told you before, and hopefully we'll have more discussions about this, I'm fascinated to understand what someone from your perspective, someone from your race, what this represents for you. I'm looking for our culture collectively to change, and I don't know how that's going to happen. I don't know if it will happen. It probably won't happen in my lifetime, but I'm really trying, and I look at it this way. It's better for us to try to do something than not do anything at all. And, I have ongoing discussions in the law enforcement world about race and policing, and particularly within DEA, and the historical perspectives of race within an agency like DEA. And this question is front and center. What do we aim to gain from talking about race within law enforcement? Well, I have to say, I can only hope that the culture changes. It has to change. Now, if it doesn't change, 100 years from now, people like you and I will be doing these video chats and talking about race and looking for a way to create some kind of, change, for them. But we have to do something. I mean, I feel I owe it to my children to try to do something. I owe it to, I, I owe it to, we both owe it to society to try to do something. Shame on us if we do. We have a moment in this country right now that is different. This is, you and I have talked about this. This is different. I'm not saying it doesn't have the potential of just kind of waning and slowly dissipating, whatever. That may happen. I hope it doesn't. I really hope that everything, whether it be media, politics, everything else that's required to be a part of this, the economy, everything else, figures out this society has a problem. It's had a problem for hundreds of years. We've accepted it. We've tolerated it. And I'm tired. I'm tired of dealing with this way of living, and it's time to change. So hopefully having these conversations and open sharing of thoughts and feelings and discussing the realities of what a Black person goes through and what a white person goes through. That's the only way that we're going to really set the foundation that I think is needed.
Thank you. And I feel I share much of your hope. And I think it is so much of the work that I do is about just getting people to talk. Like if we can just voice the reality. One of the things that I say all the time is you cannot heal what you deny is wounded. And I think that when it comes to racism, it's the same. You cannot heal racism if you deny that it exists.
Right.
It's not going to change. And for us to be able to have this conversation, and I think it is like people have been having conversations. People, mostly Black people, some white people, have been having conversations about racism and the need to change it and the systemic racism issues. And like those conversations have been happening a long time. As a social worker, we were having conversations about systemic racism. When I worked at the YWCA, it was about their slogan was eliminating racism. Like people are having conversations about racism, and they've been happening for a long time. But it's pockets of people. It's people. When
I would add though that, and I think I told you this before, and I think you kind of laughed, or at least when I tell people this, they look at me and say, "Really? Black people talk about race every single day of their life."
Right. When it's something that
it's a consciousness. When I wake up in the morning, I got to think about, okay, where am I going? What do I have to do? I have to consciously think about things. Do I want to go there? Do I want to be the only Black person in that environment? Well, that's the reality. If I want to be a part of that meeting, I have to be the only Black person. And so it's a conversation we have, as a family, or at least it's thoughts and things in the media and things you see on the news. And now it's front and center every day, and you can't avoid it. It's the proverbial elephant in the room right now.
And so this is a time, I think, because it is so prevalent, and in some way or another, I think in part because of social media, it is popping up in our awareness. Even if we're not paying that much attention, we're seeing things on the news. Somehow something about the conversations or the issue is being kind of put in our face, so to speak. And I think that does give us an opportunity where people are kind of listening, at least a little bit. Some people are listening wide open. But some people are listening a little bit. Some people are even more shut down than they were before because they're afraid. And my hope in having this conversation is that it kind of plants a seed, minimally anyway, but it plants a seed for people to recognize that you don't have to have all the answers, that we can just share with one another, that white people and Black people can have conversations, that it doesn't have to be white people, it doesn't have to be Black people trying to come up with answers or sharing experiences, that when we bring our voices together, whatever that looks like, when we bring our voices together with our various experiences and fears and dreams and all of that, that it creates more of that foundation for people to recognize, oh, I'm not alone, or I had an experience like that. Um, and he's talking about it, and nobody judged him. Nobody minimized his experience. Maybe it's okay for me to do that too. Um, and that's how we ultimately end up having bigger conversations. And it is only through a willingness to have those conversations, a willingness to be vulnerable, a willingness to recognize I don't have all the answers, that, but I'm willing to have the conversation.
Right, right.
That
I'll
is
tell you
how
though,
we change.
what gets challenging, and I'd be curious at some point, maybe in a future discussion. Not everyone is going to agree with what you just said, or not
Oh,
everyone's going to
absolutely.
agree with what I have been saying. And when I say not everyone, I mean there are Black people that will hear me talk about race that don't agree or don't look at it the way I look at it. And so um, uh, it's, but I'm willing to kind of fend that off and keep moving forward and realizing as human beings, this is a human being issue.
Yeah.
We need to talk. We need to listen. We need to share. We need to get to know each other. The relationship part of this, I think, gets us beyond someone looking at a Black person. I mean, I grew up, or even when I got into the profession I was in, people would say, "Oh, Terry, he looks good. He's polished." That was a term that white people like to use about um, Black people that don't look, you
So
know,
more white other than their skin color?
no, those that don't look aggressive and don't look,
Right.
whatever
Yeah.
their depiction of the antithesis of who I am and what I look like. I mean, I had to deal with that, and so yeah, and I can only imagine. I'm really fascinated to understand how white people listening to what you're saying. I mean, you and I are pretty much in line with the messaging here, which I think is truly, important. Um, but there are going to be people who aren't going to agree with you, and I'd be curious as to why. What is it? And then Black people that aren't going to agree with me, and I have to force myself to listen to them
And,
as well.
and that I find really, and I get it. I understand why it happens, but that I think is a really fascinating thing that hopefully we'll be able to get to in another conversation. Um, you know, so I started this talking about how this conversation came to be, and I sent out that email, right, to my community. So I recognized after sending that out, and I don't remember how long, maybe a few weeks, and I don't remember what made me pay attention. I don't know if I sent another email. I think I must have sent another email. Um, I noticed it could be just that I didn't pay really close attention when I sent that previous email about race. But when I sent my next email, I noticed I lost about 1,000 subscribers
Wow. Yeah.
between sending that email on race and the next email that I sent out. I lost 1,000 subscribers. Now, I'm almost positive because when I send it out, it shows me how many people it's sending it to. So I
Mm-hmm.
typically notice that because I'm making sure that it's working. So I tend to pay attention to some degree. I'm 99.9% sure that my numbers did not go down before I had sent that email. So people that follow me, which is so interesting to me because while I've not specifically spoken about race, I talk about a lot of the things that are kind of inherent in racial issues and the things, the shame and the fear and the importance of having difficult conversations and all of that. So I was kind of shocked to recognize that I lost 1,000 subscribers, but it didn't bother me. And I just thought, wow, it just shows even more how important this conversation is to have, because I talk about a lot of difficult things. Like I challenge people to really look at stuff, right? I'm open. I talk about all kinds of stuff, which is difficult for a lot of people to hear somebody talk really openly about difficult things. But I thought this shows even more how important this conversation is. And so you're right, there are going to be people, I'll probably lose some subscribers on YouTube. And it's disappointing, not because of losing subscribers, but it's disappointing because it just shows how much work there is to do and how challenging it is to reach those people, because all I'm asking is for people to be open. I'm not judging anybody. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just asking for all of us, to be willing to open our hearts and our minds to the things that we don't understand. The things that we don't understand, because we all have so much to learn. We all have so much to learn when it comes to a lot of things, but especially at this time, at this point in our history, we owe it to ourselves. We owe it to our neighbors, no matter what color they are, but especially our neighbors of color, our community members, our potential family members, because many of us have family members who marry somebody, fall in love with somebody, adopt somebody who is of a different race. We owe it to ourselves at this time in our life. We owe it to those that come after us to be willing to have these incredibly vulnerable and courageous conversations.
And I would just add, I agree with everything you just said. I look at racism as an evil. And
absolutely,
if something is evil, I have trouble understanding why it exists. If it is what I'm saying it is, why does it exist? Why is it accepted? Why is that evil part of humanity basically allowed to continue on? And it didn't just start in 2020. Obviously, we're talking thousands of years of humanity, and so yeah, we got a lot of work to do. A lot of work
to do, and it starts the conversation. It starts with a conversation. So thank you so much, Terry, for joining me, for sending that email back, because had you not sent that email back, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. So I'm so glad that you did. And I'm looking forward to furthering, in lots of different ways, bigger conversations around this. And thank you to all of you watching. And please feel free to share your comments, your thoughts, your reactions in the comments below, because you need to be a part of this conversation too. So thank you everybody for joining me. Thank you again, Terry, for being here. And I look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you. Thank you.